as much as it's a mateni, you know, the subject of Black Lives Matter, we feel that, you know, most of the discourse around the subject, it's not incisive, it's not penetrative, it's not too analytic, but most importantly, it's not linked to the structural problems, you know, that surround, you know, the Black life. But also the formulation, you know, because you and I, we love when we have our informal discussions to reflect on concepts, you know. The formulation that Black Lives Matter is also one that we must interrogate, you know, to who must this Black Lives Matter, and why does it always seem that we as Black people are the ones that are supposed to be explaining ourselves, that are supposed to be, you know, presenting information that should be obvious to all our race enemies about the importance of our life and our dignity, you know. And, you know, I have really reflected on a few things that I think are important, you know, that things that you have written about before as an essayist. And one of the things when you were reflecting on the brutal killing of our brothers in particular in Marikana, you said that to continue referring to him as the man in the green blanket is to perpetuate anti-Black mainstream discourse that treats Black existence as non-existent and makes Black death anonymous, or what I refer to as the anonymity of Black death. His name is Mgcineni Mambush Noki. And this is the reflection you gave on, you know, Mgcineni Noki, our brother who was mowed down, you know, in Marikana. But we have seen again a recurrence of that narrative where, you know, there is this anonymity, there is this non-existence of our existence. You know, when Kolani was paraded brutally and in a dehumanizing way, you know, through an eviction, you know, on something that's supposed to be our land, by the police in Cape Town. And we want to again say he is not the naked man, you know, he is Bulelani Kolani, you know, and he hails from a Konze originally, but now finds himself a Kailicha. And we must begin to infuse, you know, our identity into these narratives. And it is those things that I think, you know, when we talk about Black lives, they don't find expression in this context of Black Lives Matter. They don't find expression, the anonymity of Black death. And one of the things you said, that the death of a Black man will never bring the world to a standstill, you know. And I think you poignantly referred to the reason for it when you said Black death is the fuel that enables the current world to continue revolving around its anti-Black axis. Put differently, the current world cannot function at all without Black death. And this is something that you wrote, I think, is very, very important to really, you know, position the reason why, you know, our lives do not matter and why our death is something that continues to be perpetuated, because it is a fuel, you know, to the world as we know it. And without really reflecting much, Sompisi and Tingakubeli namazwi, because aliyazi noma uzothetha kantoni namhlanje, but I just thought that we have to allow you to reflect on this space. And AZAPO is an organization which is not foreign to both of us. It is, in fact, I think I want to state this. a lot of people will not know the contribution that AZAPO made to us. AZAPO is an organization that prides itself with the conscientization of Black people, whether those people are within its ranks or not. As long as they are Black and they identify with the struggles of Black people, AZAPO was an organization that seeks to touch those people. But this is also not the first time that you and me represent AZAPO. Yeah. In fact, it was in the 90s that we had the first privilege of sitting in meetings and representing AZAPO and the interest of AZAPO, particularly in the education sector in the Northern Cape where we hail from. And many people will not know that history. And I think it is important to place it on the record because our comrades from Limpopo may not have known, some of this relationship that we have with this organization. And I know that it is important for us to reflect on these things for future generations to know, But with those few words, I want to present to you a man who is an Afrocentric essayist, a man who many have an oxymoronic relationship with, whether it is love, hate, a despise, envy, but whether they resent and admire you at the same time because of the ideas that you so eloquently but also fearlessly articulate, And when you stand on a platform that is pro-Black, unashamedly and unapologetically, you are sure to ruffle the feathers of our race enemies, but also those through which, institutionalized and systemic racism, works through, whether they have the same Black skin as us or not. But we find that because of the extent to which they are immersed in institutional and systemic racism, they become an extension of that system. So today, we allow you, Sompisi, to reflect on the subject of Black Lives Matter and give us your take, and see where, as Black people, we find ourselves in relation to that. Over to you, Kotit.
Thank you. Also, let's start by thanking and appreciating the honor and the privilege that has been bestowed upon us by the Azanian People's Organization, Limpopo. And like you correctly said, AZAPO, an organization that raised many of us and contributed to our development. So we are perfectly home, in the midst of AZAPO. So it's really an honor and a privilege, and it is also important, like you said, this is part of a political education program, like you said, of AZAPO in Limpopo. And as part of political education, and as somebody who strongly believes that the heartbeat of any revolutionary movement, is constant political education, that you can't go without it. So we thought, just to get the ball rolling, we should start by reflecting on the significance of the month of July for AZAPO and the Black Consciousness Movement in particular. So some of the things we were able to uncover is that the month of July is particularly important for AZAPO and the Black Consciousness Movement. That the forerunner to all the Black consciousness organizations in South Africa, SASO, was officially launched in July, 1969, at what is now called the University of Limpopo. This, as you know, is the organization that Steve Biko led as the founding president. The month of July also marks the 48th anniversary of the founding or the launch of the Black People's Convention, you know, which is also a Black consciousness organization. You would know that at the time of his assassination, Steve Biko was the honorary president of the Black People's Convention. But another interesting thing we just uncovered, you know, when we were preparing for this, is that in some of its founding documents, you know, the Black People's Convention, rather, as early as 1972, was talking about the formation of Black banks. 1972, you know. I know there is a discussion currently, and that discussion currently on the formation of Black banks is presented as a new discussion, you know. So we now learn that it's a discussion that's over 40 years old, at least in the Black consciousness movement, you know. Now, the current Secretary General of AZAPO, Ubabu Zithulele Qindi, who was also part of the BBC, you know, I will send it to him. I have a copy of his membership card, his BBC membership card, which is dated the 22nd of November 1972. You know, it was quite huge. I have that, you know. Yes. Then there is another important anniversary, which is the 37th rather, anniversary of the launch of the Azanian students movement, AZASCO, you know. Yeah, you spoke about our interactions and representing AZAPO in the 80s. It was mainly through AZASCO, you know. July also marks the 30th anniversary of the mysterious death of one of the giants of the Black consciousness movement, Ubaba Muntu Kambies, you know, a giant, you know, in a number of respects, you know. And if you talk the Viva Frelimo rallies, for instance, you are talking about Muntu Mies, you know, he was critical in the Viva Frelimo rallies and many other things. And then 7 years ago, also in this month, AZAPO lost one of its most dedicated servants, you know, Ubongane, Ubaba Ulundi Sikab. You know, he's a former national organizer for AZAPO. He passed on in 2013, this month, you know. And another important anniversary for AZAPO this month is that you would remember that last year, around this time, the Black consciousness movement and AZAPO in particular lost one of its most gallant, you know, warriors, Ntate Nkutsueu Mutsao, you know, someone who I refer to as the commander of commanders, you know. So those anniversaries or those moments that I just cited are, in my view, very important for not just purposes of remembering, but also for purposes of orientating at a political level the younger cadreship, you know, of AZAPO, and anybody who is interested in the Black consciousness project, you know, in South Africa and any other part of the world. Those types of anniversaries are important. And the last point to make, perhaps even around that, is that as we were studying those reflections, you know, or those moments, there's a glut of literature that we just went through, you know, from SASO, the VPC, and AZAPO itself, you know, that has been written, very advanced documents and documentation, many of which I suspect many people don't have access to, you know, to those ideas. I mean, we spoke about the BBC talking about the establishment of a Black bank in the 1970s, you know, and I was thinking to myself, we should encourage the young people of AZAPO and young Black people generally to take up critical scholarship, you know, around the history and the contribution of the Black consciousness movement, because when you look at the absence of critical Black thought from a Black consciousness perspective in what is called popular discourse. You realize that one of the tragedies is that you do not get critical Black consciousness thought that comes from the tradition of AZAPO and the Black, because there is a huge tradition and a lot of literature. So I would certainly encourage people of my generation and anybody younger people that we must take those documents, find them, and I will share a couple of them as part of critical scholarship, because the universities and the schools will not do it, because of what those documents represent. You did say that the topic that really we are expected to deal with today centers around the Black Lives Matter hashtag or the movement, and we thought to grapple with that subject, we will just approach it by answering three basic questions, So the first question would be, what is the genesis of Black Lives Matter, whether as a hashtag or as a movement? And then the second one would be, what lessons can we draw from this hashtag or this movement for the South African perspective? And then we will conclude by reflecting a bit on what are the implications, of this Black Lives Matter for our purpose in South Africa. And our purpose in South Africa, I mean Black people. We concern ourselves with Black people and Black people only, because that's our only concern. So when we talk here and we say South Africa, the default understanding should be Black people, and you've teased out some of the issues actually in your introduction, about the lack of penetrating and incisive, to use your exact words, discourse around the Black Lives Matter hashtag or movement, and I share that observation. And before we go into answering the question or grappling with the question about the genesis, I just want to make two general observations. The first observation is that as Black people, we do not have a concrete understanding of our history and our place in the world. Our understanding of our history and our place in the world is very flimsy, and we take the understanding of our history and place in the world very lightly as Black people. And this is why you find that a lot of times we have to rely on other people to tell us about ourselves, that is the first general observation. The second general observation is that as a result of that weakness of not concretely understanding our history and place in the world, we look at the things that happen to us or world events in a disconnected way. And so, for instance, we would think that there's a difference between what happens to Black people in the United States of America and Black people in South Africa. We think what happens to them is not connected, and we will seek to show here how connected those things are. On the genesis of the Black Lives Matter, movement or hashtag, first, it's also important to state that it's not surprising that what happened to George Floyd, resonates so much in South Africa. It's not surprising, and there are reasons for that. And one of them is that I have stated that there are not so much, there's difference between South Africa as a polity and the United States of America, and we will break that down. One of the first things is that just like South Africa, the United States of America is essentially a European criminal colony, a European criminal colony, just like South Africa. The United States of America, when it came into being around the 1700s, was built on two monumental crimes, the genocide against the Native Americans, as they are called, and the enslavement of Black people. Those are the two monumental crimes that gave birth to the polity that we today call the United States of America. By way of detail, they had something similar, to what we call here deceptively the Anglo-Boer War, which was a war between the Dutch and the British. They had something similar there in the US, and they deceptively also referred to it as the Civil War. Civil war is between people who belong or who are native to a particular territory. If you are an invader, you are not involved in civil war. An invader is involved in imperialist war on the land of other people. So the whole concept of the American Civil War is an anomaly and a misnomer and a deception. There's no such thing. It was an imperialist war. Now that imperialist war, which was waged in what is now called America, at the end of that war, the British at the time, who are now called Americans, strangely, the British at the time then agreed to form a state or a polity, that is around 1776, and then they gathered around and drafted what they called the Declaration of Independence, at the end of that so-called Civil War. And in the drafting of that so-called Declaration of Independence, one of the major drafters is somebody who celebrated as one of the founding fathers of the US, Thomas Jefferson. He was one of the primary authors. When he presented that document, the Declaration of Independence, as it's called, the first draft was rejected by the other so-called founding fathers. Now, the reason why it was rejected is because it had a clause. It that outlawed slavery, the owning of slaves in particular. Now, the reason why these so-called founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, amongst others, rejected it is because they themselves were slave owners, So these people who are today celebrated as the founding fathers, they have them engraved and eulogized all over the United States. Those people owned Black slaves. And today they are celebrated as founding fathers, and for that declaration to be accepted, they had to expunge the clause that outlawed slavery. And that's how it got accepted as the so-called Declaration of Independence and set the basis for the formation of the polity that is referred to now as the United States of America, And what that now tells you is that the people who formed the polity, the United States of America, were not just slave owners. They were looters, they were rapists, they were mass murderers, And that being the type of people who gave birth to this polity, it can't be expected that when the United States was created, it was created with Black people like George Floyd in mind. It wasn't, And I know I often hear Black people in the United States say they contributed to the building of the United States. Yes, they did, but they did not do so out of their free will. It was forced on them, That's one. Two, their contribution in the building of the United States of America was free of charge. They were not paid a cent. They were exploited for over 300 years to build it, right? And three, the idea to birth the polity called the United States of America was not the idea of Black people. It was the idea of a group of British or European mass murderers and rapists who came from England and wanted to establish another colony, which will form part of the British Empire in that part of the world. In fact, in terms of their initial plan, the part of North America that is today referred to as Canada was also going to be part of the original United States of America in terms of their plan. And amongst themselves, they had a better fight, because they are generally gluttonous and bloodthirsty and very greedy. So they even killed each other, for that, So, but Black people were used, for a number of things, on either side, between the northern and the southern states who were fighting. But they were used as forced labor, like you said, imposed. And they were fighting a war amongst imperialist forces, racists, murderers and looters, which had nothing to do with them, So when Black people in America say they helped build the United States, it is important that we deconstruct, what their role actually was and how they came to make that contribution, because to not deconstruct that is very problematic, because it may also lead to a situation where, as it currently exists, Black people might think that they need to defend the United States for what it was meant to be, and that is the type of thing which we think we should guard against, Equally important is that part of the project of enslavement, in the United States, which was part of the process that gave birth to the United States as a territory, must also be understood in the context of something or a practice that was used to enable the project of white supremacy, which was the lynching of Black people, And so even before George Floyd, or Mike Brown, Sandra Blunt, Eric Gardner, and many other Black people that we know today of, the United States has been lynching Black people for centuries, and they were not lynching Black people as a mistake or as an error, It was as a matter of principle and functionality, that it was part of their DNA, as the Europeans who found the United States. And two important moments, long before George Floyd was even born, are important to highlight, of two Black men. The one moment is on the 23rd of July, 1899, of a Black man called, a 19-year-old Black man called Frank Embre, who was accused falsely so of raping a white girl. And after those white mob captured him, they skinned him from back to front, castrated him, and then afterwards they took pictures of how they've mutilated his body, and his body, mutilated body, was used on postcards, official postcards of the United States, in the period 1899 coming this way. And then in the 1930s, 1934 to be exact, another young Black man, by the name of Claude Neal, was falsely accused of raping a white girl, and Claude Neal was whipped so brutally that he was forced into accepting the accusation or the crime, And when they sort of relented the whipping, Claude Neal thought he was about to have some respite or breathing space. He did not know what was coming next. They castrated him and forced him publicly to eat his private parts, and they made him say he enjoyed it, Now this is long before George Floyd, long before Mike Brown, long before Sandra Blunt, 1899 coming this way to 1930. This is what the United States and the white people specifically in the United States have been doing to Black people, but in particular Black men, So it is important to understand that what happened to George Floyd, is a method that has been historically used against Black men in particular, but it's also how the United States came into being, through the mutilation, the decimation, the desecration of the Black body, it is nothing new, you know. Now, equally important, it is just to state that, just to give us an idea of the bigger picture, especially as it related to lynching, you know, what happened to George Floyd and people before him. According to the Tuskegee Institute, right, 4,743 people were lynched between 1882 and 1968. 1882 and 1968, over 4,000 people were lynched, you know. And more than 73% of those lynchings happened in the post-Civil War era in the so-called Southern state. So the point that we made initially, that this so-called Civil War that was fought there, even at the end of it, Black people continued to be lynched, especially in what is referred to as the South. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, 4,084 Black people were lynched between 1877 and 1950 in the South. 1950 is yesterday, you know. 1950 is yesterday. 1950 is yesterday. Black people were still lynched in 1950 in the traditional sense, you know. Now, it is also important to state that the lynching, you know, and what the intention of this lynching was, that the people who enabled the lynching, because there's another important thing, we hear people talk about police brutality, and we must problematize the notion of police brutality a bit. One of the sections of the white population of society that made the lynching or the killing of Black people possible, right, was a group called the Slave Patrol, you know, or they had another name which was called the Night Guards, you know. Now, the Slave Patrol was nothing else but a group of poor white people who were employed by the rich slave owners to catch slaves who had either runaway slaves, and they were called the Runaway Patrol. They were even given badges, you know. These badges that are not too dissimilar to the badges that the police are carrying today. You know, so especially in the 1850s coming this way, when they tried to formalize the police system. And the police system, not just in the United States, has its genesis in the project or the institution of slavery. You can't understand the police system and outside the project of slavery. The two are interlinked, and the police system was an enabler. So the police, as we know them in America, you know, were not formed to protect Black lives, right? They were they were formed to brutalize, to catch, to kill Black people, and to protect white life and white property. That was the original purpose of the police in America and other parts of the Western world as we know it today, you know. And so when you see them doing to what they're doing to George Floyd today, if we know our history properly, like we said in our introduction, we can't be shocked when the police are doing what they're doing to George Floyd today, because they've done it to Frank Embre in 1899. They've done it to Claude Neal in 1934. They've done it to Mary Turner in 1918. You know, they've had their necks, their knees rather, on the necks of Black people for as long as our memory can stretch. You know, so it's not a new thing. It did not start with George Floyd. You know, coming this way. So to just step off that point, it is then important to understand that the problem does not, at least in my mind, does not reside with police brutality. You know, there is a much deeper problem, you know. So, but in response to this, right, especially around 2012, you know, a movement came up especially with the killing of a 17-year-old brother called Trayvon Martin, in Florida, who was killed, like many of the black people we have read about, unarmed, killed by the police. Trayvon Martin in 2012. It is really around the killing of Trayvon Martin, that the Black Lives Matter hashtag and ultimately the movement was birthed, and then it gained momentum, with the killing of people like Mike Brown, Eric Gardner, Sandra Blunt, and many others. And so the Black Lives Matter movement in the US then became synonymous with protests against police killing black people, you understand? And as it evolved, you then began to say a number of things. That one of the first things was that as a movement, it also attracted a lot of criticism. One of the criticisms was that the protests were multiracial, So you saw a very strange thing, that it is black people who are being killed, but you see white people also holding up placards, Then it ends up, don't shoot that country. And you ask yourself, what is happening? Do you understand? Have we not learned anything from our history, The other criticism leveled against the Black Lives Matter movement was that it tended to use the same approach that the civil rights movements of the, say, 60s used, led by Dr. King and amongst others, which approach seemed to suggest that they were more interested in, liberal forms of violence. Do you understand? Yeah, types of
not upsetting the system, status quo is
those types of things, And then there was, for me, what I think one of the most serious criticisms, that this movement called Black Lives Matter receives funding from dubious people like George Soros, George Soros has got a very murderous history, as one of the white billionaires in the US, very murderous history of sponsoring coups, and what people call regime change across the world, where he finds his interest as a plutocrat and those of America are threatened. He's got that history. And he uses fronts like the Open Society Foundation. And I was bitterly disappointed to see some of the foundations in South Africa, including the Steve Biko Foundation, working with the Open Society Foundation, which has got a very reactionary and counter-revolutionary history, and agenda. And you would imagine foundations that are associated with names like Steve Biko, would have known better, So, but he is said to be one of the people who are funding Black Lives Matter. And we have had many people, activists. We have made an effort to have discussions with them in the US, to try and give us a greater perspective. It seems to be that there is credibility in the view that Black Lives Matter does receive funding from people like George Soros, and there were many other things that were said about it, but those were just some of the ones I thought are important to highlight. There are many other criticisms that are leveled against it, And so this takes us nicely now to our next point, as to that being the case, what lessons do we draw, for instance, from the Black Lives Matter phenomenon from a South African context, The first one is from the perspective, especially of the Black consciousness movement, in South Africa. We have learned that the involvement of non-Black people in the affairs of Black people has been nothing but deleterious to Black people. It has been harmful. It has not helped us. It has not taken Black people anywhere. And in fact, it has distracted Black people and misdirected Black people, you know.
And watered down the seriousness of the issues
Yes,
that are projected by those social movements.
absolutely. And I mean, there's a whole essay that Steve Biko dedicates, you know, to the white liberals in particular, you know, in I Write What I Like. You know, there's a whole essay where he tries to make us understand the danger of white involvement in Black affairs. But even before Steve Biko, people like Ubaba Muziwa Kelembet, you know, have written extensively about their own struggles as the leadership of the ANC Youth League at the time, the fights that they had with white communists within the ANC, you know, at the time, and how that undermined the project of African nationalism, you know, at the founding of the Youth League. Yes. Then there is the other thing, right, that to locate, like, the Black Lives Matter movement seems to do, the issue of the killing of Black people by the state in the United States in police brutality is also a bit problematic and ahistorical, you know, because like we correctly said, the police in America and anywhere else were not established to protect or defend Black lives. So to reduce what has been done to people like George Floyd, Eric Garner, Sandra Brand, to police brutality is to misdiagnose the problem. And it would lead to a situation where Black people fight for things like reforming the police, you know, and we expend a lot of time and energy in reforming the police when our energy should be actually directed at the root cause, you know, because police brutality does not define the essence of what happened to George Floyd or what happened to Colin's cause here, you know, or Noki, like you correctly said, you know, So,
or even
most recently, you know, to say it was really brutal. And then when the police come and they say, we have changed our methods of arrest, you know, we are no longer going to choke you. And then we celebrate, you know, because our analysis is narrow and it is based on a misdiagnosis, you know, and that should not be the focus. And we tend to see that the Black Lives Matter narrative or hashtag tends to direct people towards police brutality, right? And then we also then get to see, you've mentioned Obabu Bulelan, you know, but remember also there was Andris Tatan, you know, before Mgrineni knows, and there was the young girl from KZN, Mobilens, you know, all of whom were killed by the police, you know. And in the case of Mgrineni Noki was actually assassinated, you know, because he was shot no less than 14 times, and mainly in the upper body and in the head. Mgrineni Noki was assassinated. It was a targeted assassination, you know. And again, it is not uncommon for the police anywhere in the world to do the dirty work of the economic and political elites, because that's the exact purpose of the police, you know, in that they are the private army of the economic and political elites, you know, of any country. Then we also come to an additional lesson also, which is also important before we make the last point. The issue of Black Lives Matter being funded by people like George Soros, right, also teaches us another important lesson, which the Black Consciousness Movement has also taught us, that organizations that get funded, Black organizations, or organizations that project themselves to be Black, that get funded by non-Black people, you know, of any kind, you know, can never be regarded as the authentic representatives of Black aspirations. Because white people and other non-Black people do not just fund Black organizations. They sit and decide and choose the organizations they fund. And that funding always has an agenda. which in the majority of cases is only known to them. So there is in no way any thinking Black person can trust an organization that uses the tag Black but receives funding from the very same people who are responsible for the death, the murder, the rape of Black people. You know, you can't trust such an organization if your mind functions properly as a Black person.
It's the same like white people who join Black organizations.
Absolutely.
You know, and most of them not even joining as members, but joining with the aim of influencing the direction of the entire organization.
I mean, it's true. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed the example you're making. When white people join Black organizations, you must see how fast they ascend to leadership, you know. But also, if a white person is in a Black organization, right, that white person, you know, represents a majority, even though it could be a single white person, you know. In the sense, if anything has to be done in that organization, you know, and you have a meeting of 101 people, 100 of them being Black people, and the 101 being the white person. If anything has to be decided in that meeting, in the majority of cases, the 100 Black people will want to get the consent and the concur of this one white person. And it never works the other way around. And we see many of the organizations in South Africa that have got white members or white leaders. There's another strange phenomenon. There's white freedom fighters also, you know. I don't know what that means, but there is such a thing. Yeah. But you see how those organizations struggle when they have to articulate Black issues exclusively, because you see how those leaders have to contort their bodies and as a way of avoiding to offend their white members in their ranks. So they put themselves through that trauma, you know, by having these white people in their organizations, and they don't seem to be learning anything from our history, that it does not work. Or on the last point, which is the implications for us in South Africa. The first thing is that if we just uncritically adopt the Black Lives Matter hashtag, you know, and bring it here, you know, we are likely to find ourselves in a situation where we are involved in a reformist struggle and not a revolutionary struggle, you know. And what is the difference? A reformist struggle is not interested in dismantling the system, you know. It is interested in improving aspects of the system and finding accommodation in the system, you know. Now, a revolutionary struggle is not interested in reforming or finding accommodation in the system. The priority and the agenda of a revolutionary struggle is to dismantle, completely destroy that system, that which negates or is organized against you, you know. So the question has to be asked whether is the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement a reformist agenda or a revolutionary agenda, you know. And we who are from the Black consciousness heritage and lineage, you know, have a saying that says reform is not revolution, you know. Yeah, reform is not revolution,
even if it's said to be, you know, because revolutionary character presents itself in the practical transformation of the power relations.
Yes, yes.
So if an organization does not change the power relations, then even if you call it revolutionary, it doesn't mean that it is revolutionary.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've seen examples of many organizations in South Africa, for instance, who use the word radical, you know, as a way of describing themselves. But when you drill down to their radicality, you know, you actually realize that they are radical in being reformists. You know, they are very radical. They are radical in being reformists. You know, they are not really radical because they, like we say, don't want to dismantle the system, don't want to upset the status quo, don't want to confront the status quo, you know. They want to engage with the status quo in a respectable way, you know, and they still want to be respected by the status quo, or the ruling elite. So you find those type of deceptions, and they also use the tag black. There are many organizations today in South Africa and everywhere else who use the tag black, when in fact they are anti-black. They're radical, and they are reformists. They are black when you actually draw down, they are anti-black. And it's important for us to continually interrogate ourselves and interrogate those movements. That when we speak these things, are we really those things? Then there is also an important thing to understand, that the point that we made initially, that the United States of America and South Africa are nothing else but European criminal colonies, and to just illustrate, even when the United States had somebody who was regarded as a black president, what happened to George Floyd, right, did not stop. Black people were killed by white police, even when Obama was president, and Obama was so castrated that when he took to the podium and had to say and call it what it is, which is anti-blackness, Obama decided to call it gun problem. That we have to deal with the problem of gun violence in the US. So even though he may have known that the problem was not gun violence, that the problem was that the very foundation of the United States of America, just like the very foundation of South Africa, is anti-blackness. So if you were to use an analogy to drive the point home, if you look at South Africa and United States, and you were to compare them to a wall, right, a brick wall to be exact. In a brick wall, the bricks would be the body parts of black people, and the mortar that holds the bricks together would be the blood of black people. And that's, in my view, if you want to understand what keeps the wall that is called South Africa or the United States standing, like you said in the quote there, that it is the death of black people, right, that makes the world revolve around its anti-black axis. So South Africa and the United States of America came into being as a direct result of the mass death of black bodies, and that's how both South Africa and the United States of America are maintained. You still have about 5 minutes. Yeah. So the last couple of questions, by way of implications, is that there are also deep philosophical questions that we have to cover. When we say Black Lives Matter, right? To whom do these Black Lives Matter? Who are we talking to, as black people? Because we are black people, and we are shouting, Black Lives Matter. Who are we shouting at? And what do we expect the person we are shouting at to do? What should their response be if we are not talking to ourselves and we are talking to somebody else? The same way, if we say we can't breathe, what are we complaining? And if we are complaining to, who are we complaining? And what do we expect the person we are complaining to do? And about the question of Black Lives Mattering, to who should Black Lives matter? Does it matter to us as Black people that our lives should matter to non-Black people? You understand? Or what is the important thing? Should Black lives only matter to us as Black people? And if that is the case, what does that entail? Because do we play a part as Black people in devaluing Black life? Do we play a part? I think we do play a part, and we must interrogate our own role in devaluing Black life, in case we are expecting other people to value Black life. Lastly, it is a logical impossibility for Black life to matter in the world as currently constructed. The world as currently constructed is built on anti-blackness, and in particular anti-black violence, the gratuitous and unwarranted and unprovoked killing of black people. The world revolves around this, and it is not something that's unique to South Africa, to the United States. There are over 1 million black people who have been killed since the 1960s, right? In a place called West Papua. It's a genocide. But you don't even hear black people or people who call themselves black leaders when they go to the so-called United States, United Nations, rather. They talk about the genocides against other people. You don't hear them talking about the genocide against black people, the genocide that was executed against our people in Namibia by the Germans. The genocide that is currently unfolding in the Congo, where over 6 million black people have been wiped out. The continued killing and enslavement of black people by the Arabs, in the parts of Africa that they have captured, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, and even in a place called Yemen. There is a lot of focus on what is going on in Yemen. There are black people in Yemen called the Abdan, who are the lowest of the low, who are being exploited. Nobody talks about that, So the point that we are making is that the world, is both in its makeup and in its function anti-black. So I personally don't see any value in black people fighting for their lives to matter in a world that is designed on anti-blackness and black life. So perhaps it would make more sense for black people to fight for the destruction of this world and to usher in a world wherein the question of whether or not their lives matter will not arise or be relevant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Santis.
What a note to end it on, and really enlightening us to the reality of where we are as black people, and that maybe Black Lives Matter is not the real question we need to be confronting. It is the world in which the question that makes it possible for the question to arise that we need to be directing our efforts towards. We would like to thank you. We are told that there are some questions that we must address, and one of them is directed to you, Vuyisile. The question is if you can comment on the trademark Levi Strauss, and link it to the punishment of slavery. And I guess maybe you can extend the question to corporations that have and even continue to play a role in undermining, in devaluing, in killing us, as black people, in our enslavement, in our colonization, that have not been brought to book, that have escaped, and I had made a note about how crafty the, evasion of Lonman has been out of the Marikana narrative, because nobody talks about the complicity of Lonman in that. So if you can just comment on Levi's, Strauss, and other brands, maybe that black people may be proudly wearing it, not knowing their complicity in our enslavement.
No, thanks. Well, Levi Strauss, in Co., which is a company that manufactures clothing and especially jeans or denim, has been implicated as one of the companies that was founded during slavery. It was founded around 1850, founded during slavery, and having as part of its branding, coming from the slave era, but you see, that is not even half of the discussion, like you said, some of the banks that brought down the so-called global economy in 2008, JC Morgan, the Lehman Brothers and everything, many of those banks were established during the era of slavery, so and Levi Strauss is an important point of departure, but it's important for us to elevate the discussion to this level. There were many corporations, as they are called, that were founded on the back of slavery, made their profits out of slavery. And this is why we made the point earlier that when Black people say they built America, their labor was used to build those companies, J.C. Morgan, the Lehman Brothers, Levi Strauss, Now, it was not unique to the colony that is called America. It's unique to the UK, to Spain, it's unique to Italy, it's unique to France, it's unique to Germany. You find it in Portugal as well. Now, what that then tells you is that the bigger discussion that we should be having is that the very founding of Portugal, Spain, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, in particular, their very founding, was based on Black genocide. So the companies that were formed as a result of their founding were simply beneficiaries, if not enablers. So if you are going to punish, say by way of reparations or whatever, and you want to make that case, you must not confine yourself to companies like Levi Strauss, the Lehman Brothers, or JP Morgan, those type of institutions. I mean, even Barclays Bank, you understand? And they actually used to finance, these banks used to finance slave owners, finance slave owners as a way of them enabling the whole project of slavery. I mean, ask yourself this question. Who was manufacturing, right, the chains that were used to shackle? Who was manufacturing them? So there must be somebody who was running a company and who was supplying them. Who built the ships that made over 30,000 voyages during the transatlantic slave trade and took over 15 million Black people, many of whom perished in the sea? You understand? Who built those ships? Today you have big shipping companies that are owned by white people and Europeans. Many of them have their genesis in the slave trade, and they have changed their names to avoid lawsuits. So it is a very important question that is coming from, I think, that Doba. Yes. But I think we must elevate the discussion, But a similar question can be asked about South Africa, for instance. Companies like Sanlam, Old Mutual, what is this other company that runs multi-choice? Naspers, So we must have similar questions about those companies as to how they make their money. So, exactly, like you have an interesting thing today, right? You have the Zondo Commission for so-called state capture, Now, when are you going to have a Zondo Commission, for the companies that made their money through apartheid, colonial invasion here in South Africa? Many of them that are based in Sandton and the other capitals of South Africa. When are you going to have a Zondo Commission for those companies, to account? Do you understand? So for me, as Black people, our focus should be very penetrating,
Okay. So there's another question about why Black billionaires never support causes that are directed at the liberation or self-determination.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. First thing is we don't understand, or we don't know for a fact how many of the people who are called Black billionaires are actually billionaires. Do you understand? We have no verification, and we don't know how they became billionaires. So one of the explanations could be that given where Black people are in terms of economic relations, right, it is possible that many of the Black people who are called today billionaires, not all, but many of them, had to have had some white helpers to get where they are. And financial institutions usually play a big role in enabling a person in a capitalist economy like this is to get where they are. So if they have possibly have gotten white help, they can't really be realistically expected to all of a sudden turn around and support revolutionary causes, because revolutionary causes by definition are causes that are designed to dismantle the very system that makes billionaires. So they will be dealing with something that Amilcar Cabral calls class suicide. They will be in the realm of class suicide. So I can't imagine a person who's a black billionaire today funding a project that is aimed at dismantling the very system that made them black billionaires. It's the same thing with corruption. People who benefit from the theft, of state and public money. You can't imagine those people going out to support and fund organizations that are exposing corruption, or trying to root it out, because they understand what that system means to them. But also, I also think we must also not, and that's not what the person is saying, we must also not criminalize black people being billionaires. We must not criminalize this, especially black people who have made their money or have earned their wealth honestly. We should not frown upon those type of black people. And one of the reasons why we shouldn't do that, we are the richest continent in the world. You understand? So when a black person is rich, it should not come as a shock. It should not be a misnomer. It shouldn't be abnormal that there's a black. So later we must part with the language of calling a person a black billionaire. In a normal situation, it should not arise. The person should just be a billionaire, or they should just be wealthy. But because we are where we are, it is also understandable why people use the nomenclature like black billionaire, because there is a peculiar situation here that the majority of the declared billionaires are not black, they are white, and this is because of the problem of we have not resolved the problem of our sovereignty as a race and our independence as a race. I'm not talking about a country, because
so the default position of a billionaire is white, and that's why you have to add the prefix black to a billionaire.
Yes,
I hear you. But also there's a question of of the decolonization of the police force, which again I think you've addressed in many ways, saying that our efforts should not be in reforming the spaces where it is the consequence of the deeper problem, the root cause of the problem. It's really a symptom of the problem, rather than the problem itself. But some people are wondering then, given how you have unpacked the whole notion of Black Lives Matter, whether people in the Black consciousness movement should throw their weight behind this movement.
Well, one of the things to say also, maybe now that you asked that question, which is not an easy question, the question should not even have arisen, whether or not the Black consciousness movement in South Africa should throw its weight behind the Black Lives Matter, because the Black consciousness movement was formed long before Black Lives Matter, right? And the Black consciousness movement, like you correctly said, was formed essentially on the project of restoring the dignity of Black people. So if there's one group of people who should not be surprised or should not think Black Lives Matter is a new thing, it's people in the Black consciousness movement, So for me, I think the critical question should be, in terms of where it is currently, is the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, are they fighting for the same objectives? For me, that's really the thing, because one of the things we were taught in the Black consciousness movement is that not everything that presents itself as Black is necessarily Black, and things always have to be interrogated, And I think those who lead the Black consciousness movement are better placed to answer whether they should support the Black Lives Matter movement as an organization or not. My own view is that it's a movement which I personally think we should treat with a lot of suspicion.
Yeah,
with a lot of suspicion. I don't we should treat it with a lot of suspicion, and this is mainly based on discussions that I have had with Black brothers and sisters who are based in the US, and what their experience and interaction has been. So it would be interesting to hear what the leadership of the Black Consensus Movement thinks. That's just my thing.
But I think there is a fair amount of introspection that is necessary for the Black consciousness movement, in terms of where Black people are in time and space, and whether the tactics and the approaches towards self-determination are still relevant, and whether the Black consciousness movement as currently constructed is impactful, adequately so to really have a revolutionary outcome, or are we drifting towards a more reformist, type of thing? So I think if we answer that question, the question of whether or not social movements like Black Lives Matter, whether or not those align to the core, founding principles of the consciousness movements, would become irrelevant, because we would see the social movements for what they are, and whether or not they are undermining or really enabling the causes of Black consciousness.
Yeah, also just to enter there, the question perhaps also arises because people are frustrated, Black people are frustrated with the absence of movements like AZAPO, in the day-to-day struggles of Black people, So there is some legitimacy in the frustration that people who know what organizations like AZAPO and the entire Black movement stand for and represent ask those questions out of frustration, that we should not be hearing Black Lives Matter, when there are movements like AZAPO and other BC organizations, who have pioneered this thing in the South African context. And what have they pioneered? The focus on Black people and the issues that face Black people. As things stand now, Black people have been subsumed, and their issues have been subsumed into other narratives and other discourses. And a lot of it has to do with the absence of organizations like AZAPO from the day-to-day struggles of our people and critical political discourse in the country, because organizations like AZAPO historically have been pioneers, in shaping thinking, like you said, even of people who are not members of AZAPO. AZAPO provided what people call today thought leadership, on a number of things. But there is a view, I share that view, that today organizations like AZAPO are not doing that. And it's important to understand why that is not happening. And we should be using Black Lives Matter as a reference, Black Lives Matter as a movement that was talking about building black banks in 1972, surely you can't be saying that there's such a movement should be asking the types of questions about should they be supporting Black Lives Matter or not, when their very founding had to do with the centrality of Black people and their dignity.
No, true. And then the last question we will take, because we are already over time, it's actually a combination of a number of questions. But I think what the viewer wants to ask is, taking a cue from the topic, what are some of the implications for someone living and born in an informal settlement? Is this accidental? How does the message transmitted to such children and their parents relate to Black Lives Matter? So, but I guess the essence of the question is, what are the implications for people that are born, into a state of deprivation and abject poverty, and how does is it accidental, or is it by design that Black people find themselves in those types of setups?
Well, like we said earlier, I mean, remember we said initially that one of the reasons why we don't understand what is happening to us as Black people, and we are in the conditions we're in, is because we have a very flimsy understanding of our history and our place in the world, So we ask these types of questions, which are legitimate, primarily because we don't have a concrete understanding of our history and our place in the world. That's why we ask those types of questions. And that has to do with one of the biggest tragedies, and it is something that falls squarely on the lap of the movements like AZAPO, that we have abandoned, the project of conscientization for people. You would know, how much time we used to spend, weekly, going out to various communities as part of the AZAPO programs to go and conscientize Black people. What we used to call scope alignment. Remember scope alignment? Yes, yeah. Yeah. So the essence of scope alignment was to go out after you've trained your cadres to go and do a community-based conscientization and political education, because our understanding of political education was not an elitist thing for people to close themselves in a room and code literature and speak a mysterious English, like other people think political education is about that mysterious English and coding literature. It had to do with helping us understand our existential reality and developing a collective understanding and working out collective ways of grappling with that reality. And this is why the character of the Black consciousness movement, AZAPO in particular, was interventionist. In the area of education, remember projects like AZAMA, Black BSSP, a Black Student Study Project. In the area of health, remember CHEP, the Community Health Project. So that is the extent to which that was the logical conclusion of political education. So now that question, if we had that understanding, would understand that the conditions that Black people find themselves in, the having to sit on street corners with your paintbrush and hold up a placard and say I'm a painter, but all that indignity, that condition, and having to have young people who are addicts or slaves to nyaupe. And the other thing we don't talk about, that the majority of people in jail currently in South Africa are Black people, over 60%, 70% of them Black men, Now that is not accidental. All of that is not accidental. It is part and parcel of the whole agenda of the European colonial project. It was meant to deliver those types of outcomes. And the problem of coloniality, colonial invasion, has not been resolved. And this is why you find Black people in the cook, and Black students being the one at the beginning of each academic year, they must fight for the right to learn. It's because we've not addressed the original crime, which is the crime of a white foreign minority coming here to invade our land and taking everything to themselves and relegating us to a status of beggars. We've not resolved and grappled with it. So this is why we are dealing with all of these things. So it's not accidental, it's by design.
And that's why Tate Mangena, one of the former presidents of AZAPO, would say, you already know who lives there.
Yes.
You don't even have to ask the question.
Another question.
Yeah, so we will deal with that quickly because we promised that we will be online for a particular time. But I don't know if you want to deal with that question quickly.
Yeah, there's a question here. It says, what is the way forward in the South African perspective? Well, I suppose it's the way forward for Black people. So, to understand the way forward, you must first know what is the genesis or what problem are you dealing with in order for you to go forward to what, and in what way. So I think there is a need, given where Black people are today, with COVID-19 and the increase, in the brutality by the security forces against black people, etc. And all these problems compounding. In the light of all of that, I think one of the most urgent things that needs to be done is that we need an urgent coming together of like-minded, black people from the black consciousness space, on how we need to design a way forward based on our condition. Because as things stand now, all of these people who say they are fighting for black people on behalf of black people are speaking from different corners and they are fragmented, which in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. But what is absent in my view, and I don't get the sense it exists, there is no clearly defined and coherent black revolutionary agenda in South Africa. You have many movements that call themselves black this and the other. And I think for me, part of the way forward resides in us coming together with a view to design a coherent and well thought out black revolutionary agenda. Yeah, because these are not easy issues to resolve, So, but you need an agenda which will hopefully be translated into a program that we can work towards. Yeah.
No, thanks a lot, Sompisi. This is not the last time that we'll be engaging. We have a full program of our own for the month of July, August, and even September that we will publish soon so that people are aware what's coming up. But we'd like to thank you for your contributions and always aligning our scope, ensuring that that the light is always illuminated in our minds, and it's also not just illuminated, but in the right direction. We also would like to thank the leadership of AZAPO in Limpopo, particularly Ndate Pet Moyaha, Udibashe, and for coordinating the electronics and making sure that everyone is connected. We would like to thank our own technical team, Malo and Smongile, for making sure that we are connected and we didn't have much glitches today. But on that note, thank you very much. Let us find ways to work towards totally dismantling the system rather than trying to improve our position in it.
Yes.
Because that is the greatest risk to our self-determination.